Thanks, Thomas. Thanks for those kind comments. Let me also thank Cheryl and Anna for the presentation. I think you set the scene really well for us, and the indication was in terms of the question that was asked regarding revenue. So that's what we are going to be talking about. We are going to be talking about how Bougainville may raise revenues for the government. I mean, that's an immediate challenge. It has been an issue that the government has been thinking about for a while. And there's very little difference between the position on economic independence being taken by the leaders in Bougainville, both current and past, as well as the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, both current and past, and the leaders in both the nations. So we want to look at this very specific issue on how the ABG may raise revenues to be able to fund the many public goods and services that the government is required to provide. Before I get into the details, let me also say our apologies for the technology. All of us are learning as we go. There's no guarantee this thing is going to work, so it's so nice to have all of you on board. Could I also extend my greetings from Canberra, from the Ngunnawal country? I hope we are able to have at least some fruitful discussion, but could I also stress that there is a report that you may find quite informative because we go into a lot of details. The report is done by three of us. So Ronald Duncan, who's joined us, Theodore Levantis, who's busy, he was going to join us. All of us are economists. All of us have worked together on several projects. And this project has been as challenging and as rewarding as any others that we have worked on. So we want to acknowledge the support given to us by people in Buka, particularly the Department of Finance over there, who provided us with a lot of data, NRI, which has been extremely helpful. But also, even though with all of these lockdowns, we have been able to have these regular meetings, talk through many of the issues that we debate amongst ourselves. So if you gave us time to ask questions, I'm sure Theo and Ron will exhaust all of the time for half an hour, because we have been interacting on these issues as we have built the story in this paper. So the paper is a joint effort, but Ron and I are going to just divide up the presentation half-half. Now, before I get into the details of the numbers, which economists love to do, let me give you a few introductory remarks which underscore everything that we say. The first point I would make is that the primary task of any government, whether that be ABG or the national government of Papua New Guinea or the government of Australia, is to ensure that basic services are provided to the population at large. So all of the citizens get those basic services. And governments may do that by directly providing those services, for example, policing, or by buying those services from the private sector, such as engaging contractors to build a school or the buildings and so on, or in partnership with the private sector. So you could have what is called a public-private partnership. In some cases, the private sector may also be the non-government organizations who provide those services. And in Bougainville, the best example I can think of are the health centers run by churches in collaboration with the public sector. So that's my first point, and we'll elaborate on that in a minute. The second point I would make is that the most basic of the public goods that governments provide is law and order. And we know that society cease to function when law and order breaks down. And there's no one better than Bougainville or the Bougainvillians who know this as a fact. And let us be also clear that by law and order, we mean not just security to your person, but also to property, which means that we want contracts that are respected, can be enforced. You have an impartial arbiter in terms of the courts who would decide should there be disputes. So one of the most basic roles of governments is to ensure that there's law and order. And I'm so happy that the president has actually prioritized law and order in his inauguration speech. The other fundamental role of government is to regulate the operation of the private sector. But that, by definition, means that you can't have governments directly providing or directly being in competition with the private sector. If you want to be the one who regulates the private sector, then to the extent possible, governments should not step in providing those services which would already be provided by the private sector. As an example, we have the PMVs, the public motor vehicles, and the transportation services provided by the private sector. So there's no case for the government to step in and provide those services in competition with the private sector. The role of the government is to step in where the private sector would not provide those services. The third one, and I think this relates back to the question that was asked at the end of Cheryl's presentation, is that governments need money. So all of those provisions cost funds. And more broadly, there is a shift globally, not necessarily just in Papua New Guinea, but broadly, that the responsibility for the provision of services are now pushed down to the lower levels of governments, to the subnational governments. And also the responsibility to raise revenues to fund those services are also pushed down to the same levels of government. So this concept should not be new to Papua New Guinea. In fact, it is not new to Bougainville. The provincial system of governments in Papua New Guinea started off with that very principle, that services ought to be provided at the local level, and to the extent possible, they should also be funded locally. And I think we are moving in that direction pretty quickly now. My second last sort of basic remark is that this is an opportunity for Bougainville to design institutions that are fit for purpose. So the presentation given by Anna and Cheryl are quite timely in that we can think about designing the institutions which serve their purpose. And we can learn from both the good things and the mistakes we have made over the past, whether that be in Bougainville or elsewhere. So we can learn from that, but we can also try and avoid mistakes that were made. So this is an opportunity. The reason why I'm emphasizing this is that institutions once designed, whether that be tax system, whether that be rules of commerce, once the institutions are designed, they're extremely hard to dismantle. And finally, whatever funds are spent by the government to provide those services that I talked about earlier, it is the quality of the spending which is probably as important as the amount of money spent. Now, investments into low quality public infrastructure can bog down an economy. And that's something that we really want to avoid. So the way we do that is by ensuring that each and every public investment has a fairly rigorous cost-benefit analysis, so that we know that for the limited amount of money we have, we're getting the maximum return from those investments. And while talking about quality of public expenditure, the other thing that we want to emphasize is that there has to be a zero tolerance towards corruption. Because as soon as you have corruption, you lose the trust of the taxpayers. And you need that trust for them to spare you the cash in terms of tax revenue for the government to be able to fund those services. And I guess, I'm not suggesting that we have failed on any one of these basic principles, but I think these are the key ones that we want to bear in mind when we think about creating institutions, when we think about raising revenues for the government. Now, let me now get into the specifics. As I said, I will do half or less than half of the rest of the presentation and leave it to Ron to cover the rest. Just in terms of my initial remarks, and this again, Cheryl had raised earlier, I think Bougainville should be very proud, Papua New Guinea as a whole should be very proud for having had a peaceful referendum where the results of the referendum have been respected both at home and abroad. I mean, that's no mean achievement, particularly in a post-conflict society. So this is something that all of you should be very proud of. So I think the first step we have taken has been a sure-footed step in terms of having had a referendum that is credible, that is being respected widely. But then this is just the beginning of our long journey. As Cheryl and Anna had sort of told us, the nature of the political settlement that will be reached between the national government and the ABG is still work in progress. And I think Cheryl and Anna set out the basic principles that, or the guidelines in working through those negotiations. But what is clear is that both governments have placed priority on Bougainville being able to fund its own budget. So we call this economic independence. Now, currently the bulk of the budget, the ABG budget, is funded through grants from the national government. So the question is, how will Bougainville raise revenues to fund its provisions going forward? That's what we're looking at. Now, let me give you some facts, and in the report, we provide you a lot more detail on this. So we're looking at 2020 budget. So this is out of the Ministry of Finance in Buka. The total appropriation for the 2020 budget for the ABG was 440 million kina, of which recurrent expenditures amounted to 179 million kina, or roughly 41% of the total budget. If you're looking at the proportion of revenues raised domestically, then that was equal to 28 million kina, or in percentage terms, 15.6% of the recurrent budget was funded locally, meaning that close to 85% of the recurrent budget, and I'm talking recurrent budget because insofar as the development budget is concerned, you can fund it with loans, you can fund it with donor grants, but the recurrent budget in general has to be raised locally. 85% of the recurrent budget was funded through grants from the national government. So again, the question is, where will the revenues for a fiscally independent Bougainville come from? And this is the question we look at. Now, if we're looking at the potential sources of revenue for the ABG, we have to think both of the immediate term, or call it the short term. We can think of the medium term, and then we can think of the long term. The way we have worked through this report is that we have started thinking about what Bougainville wants to be 20, 30 years from now. So try and be futuristic. And we are assuming that Bougainville wants to be a rich, physically independent, not necessarily, it may be a nation or whatever it chooses, but it wants to be a physically independent polity. Now, I'll leave it to Ron to go over the details in terms of what are the potential sources of revenue. But in doing this futuristic analysis, we have looked at other countries around the world. We have looked at a total of 57 island economies, of whom 18 look very similar to Bougainville. And each one of them has got, we pick on 3, we pick on 1, which has depended heavily on cocoa, on agriculture, to fund its budget to grow its economy. We have looked at another one, or a couple of them, that have relied very heavily on natural resources, which is an option looked at in Bougainville. And then we have looked at a third group that have focused quite strongly on the services sector, including tourism, telecommunications, etc. And we're sort of saying, if you're looking 20 years from now, what sort of future does Bougainville want to have, and how do we get there? But before we get into those details, let me hand over to Ron to talk through the potential sources of revenue for the ABG. Ron, over to you.
Thank you. Good, thanks. Thanks, Satish, and good morning, everyone. I'd just like to repeat what Satish has said about putting good policies in place in the first instance. Yeah, that's one thing I think we've all learned as development economists working over a long period of time. It is just so difficult to change poor institutions, poor policies. So there's just a heavy responsibility on getting good institutions and good policies in place in the first instance. And that refers to the institutions that Cheryl and Anna talked about, as well as to the revenue-specific institutions that we talk about. So, as Satish said, the prospects for revenues are three: short-term, medium-term, and long-term. In the short term, expansion of the VAT, the VAT, the value-added tax, seems to be the most sensible. But it's the prospects for much expansion in the VAT are not great. Partly that will depend upon how the government can extend the formal economy. At the moment, much of the economy in Bougainville is informal, and so not much gets into the general taxation system. So what will be important is increasing the formal part of the economy, so even people who are working at a subsistence level can be purchasing goods and services from the formal economy, in which case they will be paying the VAT, and therefore that should be expanded as much as possible. The other important source of short-term revenues are from donors. I guess it's fair to say that at the moment there would be a fairly sympathetic view from donors for Bougainville to ensure that as a new entity that it gets off to the best foot possible. And what will be important with donor support is making sure that it's growth enhancing investment. That is, to make sure that what the investments that are made with donors' money are growth enhancing, and you need to look at what will investors be looking for. And Satish has mentioned the importance of law and order and the importance of secure contracts and infrastructure, things like water, sanitation, telecommunications, power. All of these things are really important if you're going to attract investors to come to your country. And there's no doubt that it will be vitally important to be able to attract foreign investors to move to Bougainville, because you need that, the new technology and the business nous that they can bring to develop whatever possibilities there are. In the immediate term, agriculture can be fairly important, and of course cocoa is the most likely source of growth there, and the prospects for cocoa look pretty good as a result of the research that ACR, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research in Canberra, has been doing. So they give us reason to believe that the productivity of the cocoa industry can be improved, that it can be rebuilt following the destruction wrought by the cocoa pod borer. But what we'd like to emphasize there is that development of smallholder cocoa cannot be the basis of long-term development of Bougainville. That might be disappointing for people to hear, but this study that we did on the 57 small island economies throughout the world convinces us that that's trying to depend upon a single crop is not ideal in terms of long-term development. It can help in the short to medium term with if cocoa production increases, smallholders' incomes will increase, and that will lead to VAT. So that will help assist in the raising revenues for the government. One can point to lessons from countries such as Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia that developed industries such as cocoa or palm oil, and but then went on to develop their economies by developing the manufacturing sector and eventually the services sector, and that involved having people have jobs to move from in agriculture into manufacturing. Fisheries is another possibility that can be developed in the medium term. Of course, there's the negotiation that will be going on between the ABG and the PNG government on the distribution of fees from the tuna catch, and that's still to be negotiated, and that can be a fairly reasonable revenue source in the medium term. But of course, it's a very volatile source of revenue. Both prices and catches are quite unstable, and that the government will have to think about how that instability can be handled. Onshore processing of tuna is another interesting opportunity. As we've seen in PNG, the establishment of onshore processing in Lae, Madang, Wewak gives good opportunities for female employment, which is very important, and that will need, as Satish has suggested, like with other investment possibilities, undertaking good benefit cost analysis to see what would be the best circumstances in which to attract foreign direct investment. In the long term, as Satish has said, tourism looks to be the way to go for Bougainville with its particular context. As he said, we looked at 57 small island economies throughout the world, and the ones that were similar to Bougainville, I think there was 18 of them, and all indications point to tourism and labour remittances being the most likely basis on which to grow the economy. But again, tourism needs good investment environment so that all those important institutions that Satish spoke about in terms of law and order and contract security, land security are important if you're going to attract tourism to Bougainville. Another possibility, of course, which everybody will be aware of, is minerals. Bougainville is promising in respect of the reserves of minerals that it has and likely has because of its location on the Rim of Fire. But of course, it's had pretty horrific experiences from minerals investments, and it's going to be really important to get a good policy environment in place if you're going to attract the kinds of investment that will be needed for the exploration and exploitation of minerals. As far as the important policies that need to be in place, with foreign direct investment, as I've mentioned several times, which is necessary to bring in the funds and the technology to exploit the advantages that Bougainville have. Doing the benefit cost analysis that will convince foreign investors that this would be a good place to come to invest is going to be really important. And part of that is having a good legislation in respect of foreign investment. Your legislation laws should encourage both domestic investment as well as foreign investment, and it's just vitally important to have good legislation in place with respect of investment. Secure access to custom land will be terribly important, and Bougainville has the example of what's been happening in Papua New Guinea through the National Land Development Program in versions 1 and 2 to follow. That's, I think, that could turn out to be just tremendously important for Papua New Guinea if they can get the right things in place, and it will also be terribly important for Bougainville to learn from what's gone right and what's gone wrong in Papua New Guinea in respect of developing secure title in the form of long-term leases to custom land. And then within the city areas, zoning and the establishment of formal titles will be important. A major issue is with respect to the distribution of resource rents, whether that's through fishing or mining or what have you, is that we've learned over many years of unfortunate events, such as with Nauru, that countries can establish trust funds to put the revenues coming from the natural resources into, but that's not so much the problem. It's how to control the expenditure of the monies coming in. And most of the time, unfortunately, even in Papua New Guinea, we've experienced waste, corruption, macroeconomic instability with respect to resource revenues. And we would strongly urge the Bougainville government to consider what countries such as Alaska and Norway have done. Alaska is probably the best model. It's put most of its revenues from its oil exports into a trust fund, and the revenues from the trust fund generate dividends or income, and those are distributed each quarter to all Alaskan citizens. And that has proved to be extremely important, unlike in other cases where funds have been put into trust funds, such as the Mineral Resources Fund in Papua New Guinea. Governments tend to change the rules so that they can get at those funds, and so they're not at all secure. What you need from a political economy point of view is to establish a mechanism whereby all citizens have an incentive to protect those funds, and that's what you have with Alaska. Every Alaskan citizen has an interest in making sure that rules are not changed so that politicians can get at at the funds that are invested or the revenues coming from those funds, because every Alaskan citizen is expecting a dividend check every quarter from the fund. And it's similar in Norway. In Norway, the money coming from their oil and gas reserves put into a fund, and the revenues from that fund fund Norway's pensions. And so that means that every Norwegian eventually expects to get a pension, and therefore they have an incentive to make sure that those pension funds are not fooled around with. And so these two examples, we believe, are really important in terms of managing resource revenues. And we would strongly urge that something of that order be adopted. The tracing of citizens through this mechanism will give all sorts of information to the government about how many citizens and the demographic characteristics of citizens. That will be very useful, besides knowing who to send the quarterly dividend checks to. So having some sort of countrywide constituency to protect funds, we believe is extremely important. So I'll leave it there. And Satish, do you have anything to add to that?
Thanks, Ron. Just in terms of finishing this off, the next steps from here onwards, as I say, the paper goes into a lot of detail on the issues that Ron and I have spoken about, but looking ahead, what we're suggesting is, first, remember I was saying the bulk of the budget, the ABG budget, something like 85% is funded from the national government, but we need to get to the bottom of that figure because there are some revenues and some expenditures which are missed from the ABG budget. And it's more the expenditures rather than the revenues, we think. In terms of expenditures, the biggest item that we have looked at is expenditure on health services, which are delivered directly from the national government, from Guinea. In terms of revenues, we know that there is a National Fisheries Authority that gives 5 million kina, but not regularly, to ABG. But there isn't any rigorous basis for that 5 million kina. I think it'll be good to link that to the value of catches out of the Bougainville waters and try and have another secure source of revenue. But on balance, I think the bulk of the revenues for the ABG budget, though nobody would dispute this, is funded from the national government, but we need to have a better figure if we are to plan ahead in terms of the resource envelope that the ABG would need to provide the services that is currently being provided in Bougainville. So that's our first step in terms of what we want to do next, or what we would recommend the ABG and the national government do next. I think the second thing we say is that for the existing grants, that includes your recurrent grants, your functional grants, your development grants from the national government. I mean, more than likely, this would be restructured. So part of the conversation has to be about how do we transition from the arrangements we currently have in terms of budgetary support to the future we're looking at. And that would be part of the discussions on reforms to institutions. I think the ABG would need to explore opportunities for securing grants and concessional loans, as Ron alluded to, from donors and multilateral agencies to fund the public investments. I think there's still a long way to go in terms of building or restoring all of those public infrastructure. And these restoration will require money. And the ABG probably has an opportunity to access grants and concessional loans from external sources for those investments. I think the fourth one we're saying is that the ABG and maybe the national government together need to look at private investments and what are the things that is holding back private investments, both locally and from abroad. Remember, those resource projects that Ron mentioned would require foreign direct investments. Even if we were to establish a tuna cannery onshore in Bougainville, more than likely that would need foreign investments, but we need to be looking at policies so as to encourage foreign direct investment, not just foreign, but also local investments. And then the last two, we need to look at access to customary land, because Bougainville has a lot of land and it has got a lot of workers looking for jobs. I think the challenge for policymakers is to draw those idle resources into production, to grow the economy, to raise income, to provide the revenues for the ABG. And finally, I think we have to think very hard in terms of institutional design on the type of taxes we are going to have and the type of tax administration we are going to have in Bougainville. And I don't think we have thought through those issues long enough or hard enough yet. Thomas, thanks. We'll finish off there and we will open up for questions.